In the annals of military history, the race for a technological edge has often been a high-stakes gamble, sometimes producing breakthroughs like the tank with a stealth bomber, and other times spawning weapons that should never have left the drawing board. Born from ambition, desperation, and hubris, these projects drained fortunes, wasted resources, and in some cases even cost lives. Instead of rewriting warfare, they became cautionary tales of catastrophic miscalculation. In this countdown, we'll uncover the top 10 failed military inventions that were total disasters, and wait until you see the one that sank before it ever fired a shot. At number 10, we encounter one of the strangest stories in modern aviation, the A-12 Avenger II, often mockingly nicknamed the Flying Dorito. Conceived in the late 1980s, this aircraft was designed by the U.S. Navy as a revolutionary stealth bomber that would replace the aging A-6 Intruder fleet. Its futuristic triangular flying wing design promised near invisibility to radar, all-weather capability, and unmatched strike power. On paper, it was supposed to be the Navy's crown jewel, a technological marvel that would dominate the skies. However, what unfolded was a spectacular tale of ambition clashing with reality. The project suffered from overwhelming technical hurdles, experimental composite materials, and overly ambitious timelines. Instead of the traditional test before mass production strategy, the Pentagon pursued a risky fly before you buy approach, leading to rushed manufacturing of a design that was not yet ready. Constant redesigns caused costs to spiral out of control, draining billions of taxpayer dollars. What was envisioned as the next generation of naval air power soon became a bottomless pit of financial mismanagement. By 1991, after years of mounting delays, cost overruns, and insurmountable engineering problems, the Pentagon pulled the plug. Not a single Avenger II ever left the ground, leaving behind only a life-size mock-up and a painful lesson in military procurement failure. The A-12 remains a symbol of how unchecked ambition, poor planning, and bureaucratic mismanagement can turn a promising idea into a monumental disaster, making it one of the greatest failed inventions in military history. At number 9, we dive into one of the most bizarre experiments of World War II, the Bat Bomb Project, also known as Project X-Ray. This outlandish weapon was the brainchild of a Kentucky dentist, Dr. Lytle S. Adams, who after visiting Carlsbad Caverns became fascinated by bats and proposed using them as living incendiary devices. Amazingly, his idea gained enough traction to reach President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who approved secret funding for the concept. The plan was both brilliant and absurd. Thousands of hibernating Mexican free-tail bats would be loaded into special canisters, each carrying a tiny, timed incendiary bomb. Dropped over Japanese cities, the bats would scatter into wooden homes, factories, and paper-based structures, igniting countless fires simultaneously. Theoretically, this would overwhelm enemy defenses and devastate urban areas with minimal effort. But reality proved far less cooperative. During field tests at a New Mexico Army airfield, chaos erupted when bats woke prematurely and roosted inside a hangar and barracks. The timed incendiaries then ignited, burning down parts of the very base that was testing them. Though no lives were lost, the incident revealed the uncontrollable nature of trying to weaponize animals on a massive scale. While the U.S. ultimately devastated Japanese cities with B-29 bombers and conventional firebombing, the Bat Bomb was quietly abandoned as impractical. Today, it stands as one of the strangest failed military inventions, a project that highlighted the desperation of wartime creativity and the unpredictable hazards of mixing nature with warfare. It remains a quirky yet cautionary tale of how far military planners were willing to go in search of an edge, even if the result was a fiery fiasco. At number 8, we roll into one of the most chaotic military experiments of World War II, the infamous Great Panjandrum. Developed by Britain's Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development in 1943, this colossal contraption looked like something out of a mad scientist's imagination. Standing over 10 feet tall, it consisted of two massive wooden wheels connected by an axle, with a drum packed full of explosives at its core. Around the outer rim were dozens of solid-fuel rockets meant to propel it forward at a blistering speed of up to 60 miles per hour. The vision was simple but daring. Unleash this rolling bomb on Normandy beaches, smash through Hitler's Atlantic Wall defenses, and detonate with devastating effect. Unfortunately, reality had other plans. From the very first test, the Panjandrum proved completely uncontrollable. Rockets frequently detached mid-launch, flying wildly in every direction, while the machine itself veered unpredictably off course. In one infamous demonstration before a gathering of military top brass and officials, the Panjandrum went berserk, zigzagging wildly, shedding flaming rockets, and finally hurtling straight toward the horrified spectators, who dove for cover behind beach obstacles and barbed wire. The spectacle turned the superweapon into an embarrassing sideshow. It was never deployed in combat, quietly scrapped after repeated disasters. Yet, some historians argue its chaotic test runs may have served as part of Operation Fortitude, the Allies' grand deception campaign to mislead the Germans about D-Day. Whether an intentional ruse or just a catastrophic flop, the Great Panjandrum remains one of history's most ridiculous failed inventions, remembered more for comedy than combat effectiveness. At number 7, we find one of the most embarrassing blunders of the Cold War, the M247 Sergeant York, a self-propelled anti-aircraft system that promised much but delivered humiliation. The US Army desperately needed a weapon to counter the rising threat of Soviet pop-up helicopters, which could launch missiles from behind cover and vanish before traditional defenses could respond. In a rush to fill this gap, the Army developed the M247 in the 1980s, piecing it together with off-the-shelf parts to save both time and money. Its design included a modified tank chassis and the radar system of an F-16 fighter jet, all bolted together in what was hailed as a quick solution. But this patchwork approach created a weapon riddled with flaws. During its infamous 1982 live-fire demonstration, the Sergeant York ignored the drone it was supposed to destroy and instead locked its twin 40mm cannons onto a nearby latrine exhaust fan, deciding it was the more important target. The embarrassing mishap shocked spectators and symbolized the project's deep flaws. Beyond that, the radar frequently mistook trees for helicopters. The turret moved too slowly to track fast aircraft, and its hydraulics leaked in cold weather, rendering it useless on a European battlefield. Despite costing nearly $2 billion, equivalent to almost $5 billion today, only 50 units were built before the program was scrapped in 1985. The M247 Sergeant York became a textbook case of how rushed engineering, bureaucratic pressure, and reliance on recycled parts can produce a disaster rather than a solution. Instead of protecting troops from aerial threats, it became a punchline in military history, a weapon remembered more for shooting at toilets than defending the skies. At number 6, we uncover one of the most peculiar inventions ever tested by the US military. Project Pigeon, a bizarre experiment led by famed psychologist B.F. Skinner during World War II. Long before the invention of GPS or laser-guided bombs, the military searched desperately for a way to accurately guide missiles to their targets. Skinner's radical idea involved training pigeons to serve as living navigation systems. In his design, the missile's nose cone had a small screen inside, projecting an image of the target. Trained pigeons were placed inside, and as they pecked at the target on the screen, sensors would translate their pecks into steering commands, adjusting the missile's flight path mid-air. Amazingly, the pigeons performed their roles flawlessly during trials, proving that the concept could work. However, despite the success, the military was hesitant to trust the fate of a multi-million-dollar weapon system to a flock of birds. More importantly, advancements in electromechanical guidance systems were rapidly making avian-guided missiles obsolete. By the late 1940s, Skinner's project was abandoned, deemed impractical despite showing promise. Project Pigeon's failure was not due to technical shortcomings, but to the relentless pace of technological progress. It stands as a fascinating reminder that even functional, creative, and scientifically sound inventions can become disasters if they are overtaken by superior solutions. While Skinner's feathered navigators never flew in battle, their story remains one of the most unusual chapters in the history of weapon development. Proof that sometimes innovation can be too far ahead of its time, yet instantly outdated by parallel advances. At number 5, we soar into the story of the XB-70 Valkyrie, one of the most spectacular aircraft ever built and one of the greatest strategic failures in US history. Conceived in the 1950s, the Valkyrie was designed to be the ultimate nuclear bomber, capable of flying at Mach 3 speeds, 3 times the speed of sound, and at altitudes so high that no Soviet fighter could touch it. With 6 massive engines, futuristic delta wings, and a sleek design, the Valkyrie looked like something out of science fiction and became a favorite among Air Force generals who envisioned it as the future of strategic warfare. But while engineers perfected the incredible aircraft, military reality shifted. The rise of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, meant nuclear payloads could now be delivered across the world in minutes, making manned bombers less relevant. Meanwhile, the Soviets developed advanced surface-to-air missiles and interceptors capable of reaching high-speed, high-altitude bombers, stripping away the Valkyrie's supposed invulnerability. Political opposition from President Eisenhower and Defense Secretary Robert McNamara further doomed the project, arguing that the costs were astronomical and the strategic role outdated. Only 2 prototypes were ever built, and tragedy struck in 1966 when one was destroyed in a mid-air collision during a photo shoot, killing a pilot. Though technologically brilliant, the Valkyrie became obsolete before it could enter service, canceled after billions had been spent. Its failure wasn't due to engineering flaws. It was a strategic mismatch between invention and necessity. The B-70 remains a haunting example of how even the most advanced and breathtaking machines can become disasters when military strategy evolves faster than technology. At number 4, we arrive at one of the most terrifyingly impractical weapons of the Cold War, the Davy Crockett nuclear mortar. A device that turned the logic of battlefield tactics into pure madness. Designed in the late 1950s, the Davy Crockett was a recoilless gun so compact that 3 soldiers and a jeep could carry it into combat. Firing a warhead with the destructive force of 20 tons of TNT, it was intended to obliterate enemy troops, tanks, or fortifications in a single shot. Yet its greatest flaw was the inescapable fact that the soldiers operating it were often within the blast radius themselves. The warhead's fallout extended nearly a quarter mile, a zone from which the crew had little chance of escaping after firing. This meant that using the weapon was as much a suicide mission as an offensive tactic. Even more alarming, the decision to unleash nuclear firepower on the battlefield rested with a small unit commander, essentially placing the trigger for potential global nuclear escalation in the hands of just 3 men in a jeep. Strategically, it embodied the absurd extremes of tactical nuclear warfare, Cold War philosophy that blurred the line between conventional and nuclear battlefields. While thousands were produced and deployed in Europe, the weapon was quietly retired in the 1970s, its impracticality undeniable. The Davy Crockett wasn't just a failed invention, it was a walking contradiction, a weapon designed to wipe out the enemy at the cost of the very troops wielding it. It stands as one of the most chilling reminders of how fear and desperation during the nuclear age could produce weapons that were disasters by design. At number 3, we take to the skies with 2 of the most ambitious yet ill-fated experiments in naval history, the USS Akron and its sister ship, the USS Macon. Built in the early 1930s, these massive rigid airships were over 780 feet long, larger than many battleships, and envisioned as flying aircraft carriers. Each could launch and recover up to 5 small Curtiss Sparrowhawk biplanes, making them airborne extensions of the U.S. fleet. The concept seemed revolutionary, an aerial platform that could scout vast ocean areas, protect naval task forces, and operate independently of vulnerable seaports. Yet the dream quickly met the brutal realities of nature. Unlike seafaring ships that could weather storms with relative stability, these giant airships were fatally vulnerable to turbulence and high winds. The USS Akron met its end in 1933 when it was caught in a storm off New Jersey and plunged into the Atlantic, killing 73 of the 76 men aboard, the deadliest airship disaster in history. Less than 2 years later, the USS Macon suffered a structural failure in a storm over the Pacific and crashed into the ocean. This time with fewer casualties, but an equally devastating loss of capability. Both disasters shattered faith in the concept of airborne carriers, permanently ending America's experiment with rigid airships as strategic weapons. The Akron and Macon were bold, imaginative projects that symbolized the optimism of early aviation, but became profound lessons in hubris. Their fate underscores a timeless truth: military innovation that ignores environmental reality courts disaster. At number 2, we explore one of the most advanced helicopters ever built, a machine that looked ready to redefine warfare, but instead became a $7.9 billion dead end, the RAH-66 Comanche. Designed in the 1990s to replace the Army's aging RAH-68 Kiowa Scouts, the Comanche was a stealth marvel. It featured radar-absorbing composites, reduced infrared emissions, a quiet acoustic profile, and sophisticated avionics, all intended to make it invisible on the battlefield. In test flights, it lived up to its promise, showcasing agility, stealth, and advanced target acquisition. But even as engineers celebrated their triumph, the nature of war shifted beneath their feet. By the early 2000s, unmanned aerial vehicles were rapidly proving their worth. Drones could carry out reconnaissance missions more cheaply, stay aloft longer, and most importantly, risk no pilot lives. Meanwhile, the Comanche consumed nearly 40% of the Army's aviation budget, leaving little funding for other critical programs. Military planners began to question whether this high-priced stealth helicopter was survivable in an era of modern anti-aircraft missiles that could swat even stealthy aircraft out of the sky. In 2004, after billions had been sunk into the project, the Pentagon canceled it outright. The Comanche's failure was not one of engineering, it was one of strategic timing. It entered a world where drones had already made its role obsolete. Its story proves that in warfare, being advanced is not enough. Technology must also be relevant to the fight ahead, or it becomes a disaster, no matter how brilliantly it is built. Finally, at number 1, we come to perhaps the most infamous military disaster of all time, the sinking of the Vasa warship in 1628. Commissioned by Sweden's King Gustavus Adolphus, the Vasa was intended to be the most formidable naval vessel of its era, a floating fortress meant to dominate the Baltic and showcase Sweden's rising power. Lavishly decorated and armed with an unprecedented number of heavy bronze cannons, it represented the king's ambition to project both military might and royal prestige. But ambition proved its undoing. The king's constant demands for more guns and grandeur pushed the design beyond safe limits, leaving the vessel fatally top-heavy and unstable. Warnings were ignored, including a pre-launch stability test where 30 sailors running across the deck nearly tipped the ship. Still, the Vasa was launched with great ceremony on August 10, 1628. Within minutes, a modest gust of wind caught its sails. The ship tilted, water rushed through the open gun ports, and the pride of the Swedish Navy sank less than a mile from shore, drowning dozens of crew in front of horrified onlookers. Preserved in the cold Baltic waters for over 300 years before being salvaged, the Vasa now sits in a Stockholm museum as both a cultural treasure and a sobering warning. Its legacy is eternal proof that poor management, unchecked ambition, and the dismissal of expert advice can sink even the most powerful projects. Whether in the 17th century or the 21st, the Vasa remains the ultimate symbol of how military inventions can become spectacular disasters before they even face the enemy. The history of military innovation shows us both the heights of human genius and the depths of human folly. From the Vasa's royal hubris to the Comanche's untimely obsolescence, these disasters reveal a pattern of overconfidence, misjudgment, and failure to adapt. Their financial costs were staggering, but the human costs were far greater: lives lost in the pursuit of flawed dreams. These failures stand as timeless reminders that ambition without wisdom can be just as deadly as any enemy. If you enjoyed this countdown, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more fascinating history and hidden truths.